I couldn't stand it anymore, so I knocked on my stepson's door late one night, my heart racing and my mind filled with doubt. What would you do if a forbidden connection pushed you to the edge of everything you thought you knew? That night, a single knock threatened to unravel everything: my marriage, my family, and my sense of self. What happens when lines are crossed and secrets are no longer safe? Before we dive into this unforgettable story, make sure to subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this incredible journey. When I stood outside my stepson's room, heart pounding and palms sweating, I knew I'd crossed a line I could never undo. The soft murmur of his voice filtered through the crack of the door, low and comforting, as if he were talking to someone or perhaps just thinking out loud. My hand hovered over the doorframe, uncertain. How did it come to this? A whirlwind of guilt and longing churned inside me, and I wasn't sure which emotion would win out. The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room downstairs. My husband was away again, as he always was, chasing deals and shaking hands in far-off cities, while I was left to tend to the life he'd built. Only, lately, I didn't feel like a part of it. The distance between us had grown into a chasm so wide, I doubted even he noticed my absence anymore. Then he moved back in. My stepson, Eric, had returned from college just a few months ago, and with him came a presence I didn't know how to handle. He wasn't the awkward teenager I'd married into. No, he was a man now. Tall, confident, with an easy charm that lit up a room. At first it was innocent enough. I'd bake his favorite cookies, he'd fix the leaky faucet in the bathroom. We laughed more than I had in years, but somewhere along the way the lines blurred. I could feel it in the way his gaze lingered a second too long when we spoke, or the way he'd brush my shoulder lightly as he passed me in the hall. I told myself I was imagining it, clinging to fantasies that had no place in reality. But the truth was, I felt alive when he was around, in a way I hadn't since before I said I do. A muffled laugh brought me back to the moment. His door was slightly ajar, and the soft glow of his desk lamp spilled into the dark hallway. My breathing hitched as I fought the war raging within me. Curiosity gnawed at me, but shame held me back. What excuse could I possibly have for knocking on his door this late at night? Before I could talk myself out of it, my knuckles rapped against the wood. Softly, hesitantly. My fingers trembled on the doorknob as I pushed it open. There he was, sitting at his desk, his messy brown hair catching the light. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "Hey," he said casually, though his brow furrowed slightly. "Is everything okay?" I nodded, unsure of what I was even doing there. I couldn't sleep," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, and for a moment the world seemed to fall away. Eric's smile lingered for a moment, and then he tilted his head, motioning toward the chair by his desk. "Do you want to sit?" he asked, his voice soft and disarming. I hesitated. This was a mistake. I knew it was. But the warmth in his expression, the gentle concern in his tone, made it impossible to turn away. "Just for a minute," I murmured, crossing the room and sinking into the chair. The small space smelled faintly of his cologne, a clean, woodsy scent that clung to the air around him. His desk was cluttered with papers and books, evidence of the late-night studying he claimed was keeping him up. "Studying?" I asked, gesturing toward the chaos. "Trying to," he said with a chuckle, leaning back in his chair. "But Guess my mind's been wandering tonight." His gaze flickered to me, a hint of something unreadable in his eyes. "What about you? Couldn't sleep?" "No," I admitted, feeling exposed under his steady gaze. "The house feels too quiet without your father home." The words came out sharper than I intended, and I quickly added, Not that I mind having you around. It's been nice having someone to talk to." His smile returned, soft and knowing. "Well, I'm glad I can keep you company." His voice dipped lower, carrying a warmth that seemed to settle in my chest. "You deserve that." I looked away, heat rising to my cheeks. It had been years since someone spoke to me like that, with genuine care and attention. My husband, Mark, had become a shadow in my life. There, but distant, his focus always elsewhere. The man I'd married had been full of promises, but somewhere along the way, those promises faded, leaving behind a hollow routine. Eric leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk as his tone shifted, playful yet sincere. "You know you don't have to worry so much. You're allowed to take time for yourself to feel alive." The words struck a chord deep within me. I opened my mouth to respond, but the vulnerability in his eyes stopped me short. Was I imagining it, or was there something unspoken between us? I swallowed hard and glanced at the clock. "I should go," I said quickly, rising from the chair. "It's late." Eric stood as well, his height suddenly imposing in the small room. He took a step closer, and I felt the air grow heavy again, charged with an unspoken tension. "You don't have to," he said quietly. My breath caught. "Eric." His name felt foreign on my lips in that moment, as though saying it out loud would make the unspeakable real. It was all I could do not to rush across the room and take his, and accept it unconditionally. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, stepping back and running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," I said, too quickly to sound convincing. I should go. Good night." Without waiting for a response, I turned and left the room, my heart pounding as I closed the door behind me. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and self-recrimination. I tried to push the moment out of my mind, to convince myself it was nothing, but the memory lingered like a stubborn shadow. Eric, for his part, seemed to sense the shift. He kept his distance, his usual playful demeanor subdued. I told myself it was for the best. The lines we'd almost crossed weren't just inappropriate. They were impossible. I was his stepmother, and even entertaining the thoughts that had crept into my mind was a betrayal of everything I thought I stood for. And yet I couldn't ignore the spark that had been reignited within me. For the first time in years, I felt seen, wanted, alive. It wasn't just the attention Eric gave me, it was the way he made me feel, as though I were more than just a wife or a caretaker. I was a woman. One evening, a week after that night in his room, I found myself in the kitchen preparing dinner. The clatter of pots and the rhythmic chopping of vegetables filled the air, but my thoughts were elsewhere. The faint creak of footsteps behind me made me turn, and there he was, leaning against the doorway. "Hey," he said casually, though there was a tension in his posture that betrayed the calm in his voice. "Hey," I replied, forcing a smile. "Hungry?" "Starving," he said, stepping into the room. He moved to the counter, standing closer than he needed to as he reached for a glass from the cabinet. His arm brushed mine, and the contact sent a jolt through me. I froze, my hand hovering over the cutting board. "Eric." He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, unsure of what he wanted, or perhaps too afraid to find out. "About what?" "About the other night." His voice was steady, but his eyes held a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. "I don't want things to be weird between us." "They're not," I lied, returning to my chopping. "You don't need to worry about that. Just—" His use of my first name stopped me cold. It wasn't the first time he'd called me that, but it felt different now. Intimate, in a way that sent my heart racing. "Please, just talk to me." I set down the knife and turned to face him. "What do you want me to say, Eric? That it didn't happen? That I don't feel—" I stopped myself, the words catching in my throat. "You don't feel what?" he pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "It doesn't matter. It can't." His hand brushed against mine, and the warmth of his touch sent shivers up my spine. "It does matter," he said firmly. "You matter." I pulled my hand away, retreating a step. "Eric, we can't. This isn't right." He nodded, though the pain in his eyes was clear. "I know," he said softly, "but it doesn't make it any easier." "It doesn't if you're sleeping with him, for Christ's sake." I breathed. "What did you do?" We stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. Finally, I broke the tension with a shaky breath. "Dinner's almost ready," I said, turning back to the counter. Eric lingered for a moment before stepping away. "Okay," he said, his voice tinged with resignation. "I'll set the table." As he left the room, I pressed my palms against the counter, struggling to steady myself. Whatever this was, it couldn't go any further. But as much as I tried to convince myself, a small, treacherous part of me wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon, with every glance and accidental touch threatening to send me plummeting into the depths of something I wasn't ready to name. Eric and I danced around each other, careful to maintain the semblance of normalcy, but the tension simmered beneath the surface, ready to boil over at any moment. I thought I could handle it, keep things contained, pretend that night in his room had been a moment of weakness that would never happen again. But pretending was exhausting, and my resolve was paper thin. One evening, the storm finally broke. Mark was still out of town, his frequent absence now more a relief than a source of loneliness. I was curled up on the couch with a book, the soft hum of the television in the background, when Eric walked into the room. He wasn't his usual composed self. His shoulders were tense, his expression conflicted. "Hey," I said cautiously, setting the book aside. "Everything okay?" He hesitated, then sat down at the far end of the couch, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I need to say something, and I don't know if it's the right thing to do, but I can't keep it in anymore." My pulse quickened, the warning bells in my mind clashing with the inexplicable anticipation curling in my stomach. "Eric," I started, but he cut me off. "Please, just let me talk," he said, his voice almost pleading. He ran a hand through his hair, then looked directly at me, his gaze unwavering. "I don't know when it started, but I can't stop thinking about you. It's not just attraction. It's more than that. You're kind, smart and beautiful, and I know it's wrong to feel this way, but I can't help it. My breath hitched. Hearing him say the words out loud was like lighting a match in a room already filled with gasoline. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was mistaken, but the truth was, I felt the same way. "Eric," I said softly, my voice trembling, "this isn't right. You know that." He nodded, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I know, but that doesn't change how I feel." I closed my eyes, trying to summon the strength to put an end to this before it spiraled any further. "We can't do this," I said firmly, though the conviction in my voice wavered. "You're my stepson, and I'm married to your father. This isn't something we can act on." A ray glimmered in the depths of his eyes, his mouth twisting into a wicked grin. "I'm not asking you to do anything," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know, because pretending everything's normal is killing me." The vulnerability in his voice pierced through my defenses, and before I could stop myself, I reached out and took his hand. His fingers were warm, his grip tentative, as if he were afraid to hold on too tightly. "I care about you too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we have to be careful. There are too many people who could get hurt." He looked down at our joined hands, his expression a mix of relief and sadness. "I know, I needed to hear you say it." For a moment, the world seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of us in the silence of the living room. But the spell was broken when I heard a car pulling into the driveway. I dropped his hand as though it had burned me, and Eric jumped to his feet, the tension snapping back into place. "Dad's home early," he said, his voice tight. I nodded, my heart racing as I grabbed my book and tried to look composed. Moments later, Mark walked in, his face lighting up in a rare smile when he saw us. "Hey, you two. Everything okay?" "Yeah," Eric said quickly, shoving his hands into his pockets. "We were just watching TV." Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised but not suspicious. "Well, it's good to see you two getting along. I'll take a quick shower before dinner." "Damn." As soon as Mark disappeared upstairs, I turned to Eric. "This has to stop," I whispered, my voice urgent. "We can't let this go any further." He nodded, his jaw tight. "I get it. I'll back off." But even as he said the words, I could see the conflict in his eyes. And the truth was, I wasn't sure I wanted him to. Shayram stopped suddenly. I took a step toward him, surprised by the urgency. The following weekend, Mark announced he'd be heading out of town again for a work retreat. I tried to ignore the way my heart leapt at the thought of being alone with Eric, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But the more I denied it, the more undeniable it became. That Saturday, the house was quiet once more. Eric was in the backyard, tinkering with the old barbecue grill that Mark hadn't touched in years. I watched him through the window, his shirt clinging to his back as he worked in the afternoon sun. The sight stirred something in me that I couldn't push away, no matter how hard I tried. I decided to bring him a glass of iced tea, telling myself it was a harmless gesture. But as I stepped outside, the tension crackled between us like static electricity. "Thanks," he said, taking the glass from me. His fingers brushed mine, lingering just a second too long. "You're welcome," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He set the glass down and turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Jess, are you okay?" I looked away, the weight of his gaze too much to bear. "I'm fine," I said quickly. Why wouldn't I be? I could feel the fawning blossom in my chest. "Because you seem different," he said, stepping closer. "And I don't think it's just me." "Ah," Richie murmured, the words too small for him to speak. I swallowed hard, the heat of the moment wrapping around us like a cocoon. "Eric, we can't—" "I know," he said, cutting me off, "but that doesn't mean I don't want to." His words hung in the air between us, daring me to respond. My mind screamed at me to walk away, to put an end to this once and for all. But my heart, my traitorous, aching heart, wanted nothing more than to close the distance between us. And then, without thinking, I did. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if both of us were testing the waters of something forbidden. My hands rested lightly on his chest, the warmth of his skin radiating through the fabric of his shirt. For a moment the world disappeared. No husband, no rules, no consequences, just us. But as the kiss deepened, reality came crashing back. I pulled away abruptly, my breath ragged, and took a shaky step back. "Eric, this isn't right," I whispered, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his face a mixture of longing and guilt. "I know," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "No, it's not just you," I interrupted, shaking my head. "I'm as much to blame as you are." We stood there in silence, the weight of our actions pressing down on us. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the backyard, a stark reminder of how far we'd gone and how far we couldn't go. "I should go inside," I said finally, my voice hollow. "We can't let this happen again." "Jess," he said softly, stepping closer, but I raised a hand to stop him. "No," I said firmly, though my heart ached with the effort. "We have to draw the line here, for everyone's sake." He nodded reluctantly, his jaw tightening as he looked away. "I understand." I turned and walked back into the house, my legs feeling like they might give out beneath me. Inside, I leaned against the counter, trying to steady my breathing. My lips still tingled from his kiss, a cruel reminder of what I was walking away from. Over the next few days, I threw myself into distractions, desperate to suppress the feelings threatening to consume me. I cleaned the house obsessively, took long walks around the neighborhood, and avoided being alone with Eric at all costs. He seemed to sense my withdrawal and kept his distance, though I often caught him watching me from across the room, his gaze heavy with unspoken words. Mark returned from his trip, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and a quick recount of his meetings, his attention already shifting to his phone before he'd even unpacked. I listened dutifully, nodding in the right places, but my mind was elsewhere. That evening, as we sat at the dinner table, the three of us, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Mark, as usual, was absorbed in his work emails, leaving Eric and me to navigate the silence. "So," Mark said, finally looking up, "have things been around here? Anything exciting happen while I was gone?" Eric and I exchanged a quick glance, the memory of our kiss flashing between us like a neon sign. "No," I said quickly, my voice too loud, too defensive. "Just the usual." Mark raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Eric cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. I helped Jess with the grill," he offered, his tone casual. "Oh?" Mark looked genuinely surprised. "I didn't even know we still had that thing." "It was pretty rusted," Eric said with a shrug. "Figured it might come in handy this summer." Gray sighed. Good thinking, Mark said, already turning his attention back to his phone. I'll have to check it out sometime. The conversation fizzled, leaving the room in an uneasy quiet. I excused myself as soon as I could, retreating to the kitchen to busy myself with the dishes. The sound of running water did little to drown out the whirlwind of emotion swirling inside me. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, as Mark snored softly beside me. My thoughts drifted to Eric, as they so often did, and I felt a pang of guilt twist in my chest. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between duty and desire, between right and wrong. The next morning, I made a decision. I found Eric in the living room, sitting on the couch with a book in his lap. He looked up when I entered, his expression wary. We need to talk, I said, my voice steady. He set the book aside and gestured for me to sit, but I shook my head, remaining standing. I can't keep doing this, I said, crossing my arms over my chest. Whatever this is between us, it has to stop. Completely. I know, he said, his voice calm but tinged with sadness. I've been thinking the same thing. I nodded, relieved that he understood, but heartbroken all the same. You mean a lot to me, Eric. More than I can put into words. But this, it's not fair to you or to me or to your father. I get it, he said, standing to face me. I don't want to make things harder for you or for him. Thank you, I said, my voice cracking. I'm so sorry if I've hurt you. He shook his head, a small, sad smile on his lips. You haven't. If anything, you've shown me what it feels like to truly care about someone, and I'll always be grateful for that. Until tears welled in my eyes as I reached out and squeezed his hand. You'll find someone, Eric. Someone who can love you the way you deserve. He nodded, though his eyes shimmered with unshed tears. You too, Jess, he murmured. We stood there for a moment, the weight of our goodbye settling between us. Then, without another word, I turned and walked away, my heart breaking with every step. The rest of the summer passed in a blur of strange smiles and awkward silences. Eric kept his distance, spending more time out of the house and throwing himself into his work. Mark remained blissfully unaware, his attention focused on his career, as always. And me? I tried to piece myself back together, to find a way to reconcile the woman I wanted to be with the woman I was. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the only path forward. One evening, as I stood on the back porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of bittersweet peace settle over me. The pain of letting go still lingered, but so did the memory of what it felt like to be truly seen, if only for a moment. I would carry that memory with me, not as a burden, but as a reminder of what was and what could never be. Life moved on, but the shadow of what had happened lingered, an unspoken truth etched into the walls of our home. Eric returned to college, and I threw myself into the routines of daily life, trying to outrun the feelings I couldn't entirely shake. Some days I managed to forget. Other days the memory of his touch, his voice, his gaze crept in uninvited, filling the quiet moments with bittersweet ache. Mark remained oblivious. His work continued to dominate his time, leaving me to handle the emotional void he seemed incapable of noticing. I resented him for it some days, for not seeing the parts of me that were breaking. But perhaps that was for the best. If he couldn't see me, he couldn't see the guilt I carried. I often found myself reflecting on how I had gotten to that place. how a marriage that once held promise had left me feeling so unseen that I craved attention elsewhere. I didn't blame Eric. If anything, I blamed myself for allowing the lines to blur, for indulging in a fantasy that could never be. But in those moments of reflection, I also learned something about myself. I'd spent so much time defining my worth through my roles as a wife, a caretaker, a stepmother. I hadn't stopped to think about who I was beyond those labels, what I needed, what I wanted. Eric had awakened something in me, something I couldn't deny, even as I regretted the circumstances under which it surfaced. Epic finale, 4,000 words. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Eric returned home for a weekend visit. I'd spent the morning cleaning, trying to busy my hands and quiet my thoughts. The leaves had turned vibrant shades of orange and red, scattering across the yard like a painting. I was raking when I heard his car pull into the driveway. "Hey, Jess," he called, his voice warm but cautious. He stepped out, carrying a bag over his shoulder. He looked older somehow, more assured, but the familiar softness in his eyes hadn't changed. "Hi, Eric," I replied, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. "How's school?" "It's good," he said, walking over to join me. "Busy, but good." We fell into an easy rhythm, the conversation light and familiar, as he helped me gather the leaves into neat piles. For a moment it felt like old times, before the weight of unspoken feelings had changed everything. When we finished, I offered him a glass of iced tea and we sat together on the porch steps, watching the late afternoon sun filter through the trees. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged, as if both of us were waiting for the other to say something. "I've been thinking," he said finally, breaking the quiet, "about us, about what happened." I stiffened, gripping the glass in my hands. "Eric, let me finish," he said gently. "I don't regret it, Jess. I don't regret feeling the way I did about you, but I know it couldn't have gone any further, and I want you to know I'm okay with that." I turned to look at him, his expression sincere. "You've grown a lot," I said softly, my voice tinged with both pride and sadness. "I'm glad you're okay." He nodded, his gaze distant as he stared out at the yard. "It's just, you made me feel something I hadn't felt before. Like I was worth more than I thought I was, and I'll always be grateful for that." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I reached out to place a hand on his arm. "You are worth so much, Eric. Don't ever forget that." We sat there for a while, the sun dipping lower in the sky. It felt like closure, a way to put the past behind us, without erasing what it had meant. As the weekend went on, I found myself more at peace than I had been in months. Eric and I shared laughs and stories, the tension that had once filled the air replaced with an easy camaraderie. When he left on Sunday evening, it felt like a goodbye to more than just the weekend. It was a goodbye to the version of us that had existed in that fragile, fleeting moment. Life didn't magically fix itself after that, but it felt manageable again. I began to focus on the things I could change, rekindling old friendships, picking up hobbies I'd abandoned, and finding pieces of myself I'd forgotten. Mark and I started therapy, and while the road ahead was uncertain, I held on to a small sliver of hope. As for Eric, he continued to grow into the man I always knew he could be. He visited less frequently as his life became busier, but when he did, our interactions were warm, familiar, and free of the tension that had once defined them. Sometimes, late at night, I still thought about what might have been, but those thoughts no longer filled me with regret. Instead, they reminded me of the strength it took to walk away and the lessons I'd learned along the way. I wasn't perfect and neither was life, but in the end I found a way to carry on, to build something better from the pieces of what once was. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. A few weeks later, the echoes of that autumn afternoon lingered in my mind as life resumed its steady pace. The days felt calmer, less fraught with the intensity of emotions that had consumed me before. But the sense of resolution was fragile, and I knew it would take just one unexpected moment to stir the embers of a fire I had worked so hard to extinguish. That moment came on a cold winter evening. Mark was hosting a small dinner party for his colleagues, a rare attempt to blend work with home life. The house buzzed with laughter and chatter as the guests sipped wine and exchanged polite anecdotes. I played my role as the gracious hostess, smiling and offering refills. But my mind was elsewhere. Eric had arrived unexpectedly earlier that day. He'd claimed it was to see his father, but the tension in his demeanor suggested there was more to his visit. We had exchanged little more than pleasantries, the space between us both deliberate and stifling. He'd spent most of the evening seated in the corner of the living room, nursing a drink and avoiding eye contact. As the evening wore on, I found myself retreating to the kitchen for a moment of quiet. I leaned against the counter, letting the hum of conversation in the other room fade into the background. The air was cool, and I could feel the ache of exhaustion settling into my bones. "You okay?" Eric's voice startled me, and I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Yeah," I said quickly, straightening up. "Just needed a break." He stepped inside, his presence filling the small space. "It looks like a lot of work," he said, glancing at the array of empty glasses and plates waiting to be washed. "It is," I admitted with a tired smile. "Your dad doesn't realize how much goes into these things." Eric's expression softened, a trace of the boy I'd known before all of this coming through. "You've always done so much for him," he said. "For us." Us. I looked down, the weight of his words pressing against my chest. "It's what I signed up for," I said lightly, though the bitterness in my tone was hard to miss. He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Jess, you deserve more than this. More than whatever this is." I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I forced a smile. "Eric, let's not." "I'm not trying to stir things up," he said quickly. I hate seeing you like this. You're so much more than just a hostess or a wife who gets overlooked." The sincerity in his voice was disarming, and for a moment I let myself believe him. But the moment passed, and reality settled back in. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice trembling. "But I've made my choices. This is my life." He nodded, though his jaw tightened as if he wanted to argue. Instead, he took a step back, giving me space. "I'll let you get back to it," he said quietly, and then he was gone. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Eric's words replayed in my mind, stirring a mix of emotions I wasn't ready to face. As the last of the guests trickled out and Mark retired to his office, I found myself standing alone in the living room, staring at the remnants of the night. Glasses, half-empty plates, and crumpled napkins littered the space, a chaotic reminder of the role I'd played. I began cleaning up, letting the monotonous task soothe my restless thoughts. I was halfway through when I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see Eric standing in the doorway, his coat slung over his arm. "I'm heading out," he said, his voice neutral. "Okay," I said, pausing in my work. Thanks for coming. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. Jess, can I say one more thing? I nodded, bracing myself. I know you've made your choices, he said, his tone measured, and I respect that. But I also know you're not happy, and you don't have to settle for this. Not for him, not for anyone. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. He stepped closer, his expression earnest. You deserve to be happy, Jess. Don't forget that. With that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving me standing in the dimly lit room, his words echoing in my mind. I inhaled. In the weeks that followed, I found myself replaying that moment over and over. Eric's departure had felt final, like a chapter of my life closing for good. And yet, his words stayed with me, challenging me to reevaluate everything I thought I knew about myself. I began making small changes. I started volunteering at a local community center, rediscovering parts of myself I'd buried beneath the roles of wife and stepmother. I joined a book club, reconnecting with the simple joy of being surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could do for them. Mark noticed the changes but said little. His world continued to revolve around his work, and I found myself less inclined to orbit around it. Our conversations grew fewer, our silences more frequent, but I didn't feel the same urgency to fix it. I was learning to focus on myself, to find happiness on my own terms. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mark joined me, a rare occurrence. He sat down beside me, the quiet stretching between us. You've been different lately, he said finally, his tone cautious. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the horizon. I've been trying to figure things out. He hesitated, then asked, And have you? I turned to look at him, the man I'd once loved with all my heart. I think so, I said softly. I'm learning to be okay with who I am. He nodded, though his expression was unreadable. I want you to be happy, he said after a long pause. Whatever that looks like. For the first time in years, I believed him, and for the first time in years, I believed I might actually get there. The memory of Eric remained, not as a source of pain or regret, but as a reminder of the person I was striving to become. He had awakened something in me, something I couldn't ignore. And though our paths had diverged, the lessons he'd taught me stayed with me. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time, that felt like enough. As the months turned to years, the memory of Eric faded into a quiet corner of my heart, not erased, but softened by time. Our paths crossed occasionally at family gatherings, each interaction marked by a warmth that hinted at the connection we'd once shared, but now understood, couldn't be rekindled. He grew into his own life, thriving in ways that made me proud, even from a distance. Mark and I eventually went our separate ways. It wasn't a dramatic end, but a mutual acknowledgement that we had drifted too far apart to find our way back. It was bittersweet, but it also gave me the freedom to rediscover myself in ways I hadn't imagined. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream, to explore, to be. Eric's words still lingered in my mind on occasion, his gentle reminder that I deserved to be happy. It wasn't a guiding mantra, but a quiet whisper, a nudge toward the life I was slowly building. I started painting again, a hobby I'd abandoned long ago, and found solace in the swirling colors and quiet meditations it offered. Looking back, I don't regret the moments we shared, even the ones that crossed lines. They were a part of my story, a reflection of a woman searching for something more. And while they shaped me, they didn't define me. Life moved on, as it always does, and I moved with it, stronger, wiser, and more certain of the person I wanted to be. Farewells are rarely easy, but they're often necessary. Letting go of Eric was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it also freed me to find myself. And for that, I'll always be grateful.